So we're ready to go with our course on compositing here, but a couple of thoughts before we get started. And that is, I've taught compositing sessions quite often, and one of the comments that people would often come up and say is, well, yeah, but you start with photographs taken on a plain background, so it's easier. And my response is, well, yes. And that's kind of the point. If you're not the photographer, if someone hands you a photograph of a person taken in front of a crazy background like a forest, and they say, just take them out and put them on this other background, be prepared. It's going to be harder. It's going to take longer because that's the nature of the beast. So our focus here is you're the photographer, or at least you're in contact with the photographer, and you're going to do things like, if you're outside somewhere and you're in front of some crazy background and you think, oh, I might want to do some compositing, just look around and go, oh, there's a plain wall over there. Let's have you stand in front of that. And that can make a huge difference because that way it's going to make your life simpler. So yes, we are going to talk about taking someone off a white background, a green screen, a gray background, but the techniques we're going to use, and I will show at least one example of one that's more difficult, but you can make your life a lot simpler if you start off by taking some photographs with compositing in mind. Now, we will talk in that section a little bit about lighting and shooting. We'll also talk about green screen, its pros and cons. But the main thing we're going to spend our time doing is once you've captured the image with a plan in mind, then we're going to Photoshop and do our selecting and masking. So let's get started. At the beginning, I talked about thinking backwards and shooting with your backgrounds in mind. And that's a great concept if you already have some backgrounds. So here's some suggestions on what to think about. Now, you can certainly find background images. You can use stock photos. You can use images that are sold in background collections, but the challenge with most of them is the fact that they're really, I think, best intended for waist-up kind of shots because it's hard to composite someone in standing when they're not shot with that in mind. So if you're out shooting yourself, then give yourself some options. Shoot at different angles, standing up, kneeling down, off to the left, off to the right, change the exposure, change the focal point. Give yourself options. Go looking anywhere you can find a background. As you walk around, you see a city street, an alleyway, a cool building. Just make sure you grab different angles and different exposures so that when you're trying to match things up later, it makes better sense. I think it's really important to start with a plan, and one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to think backwards. Think about the end result first, and then capture accordingly. So ideally, you should have a background in mind. If you don't, then here's the other idea, is think ahead to the fact that you still want to match up your person with the background. So when you're taking photographs, don't just take one straight on, alter your angle, go further down, go higher up, give yourself some options. Here's an example. I was shooting with this fellow, and it was a rainy day. We were under an overpass. The backgrounds really weren't that interesting. So in my head, I was thinking, well, I know I have some backgrounds that I can use. And one particular one I remembered was kind of a stairway looking up at an angle. Well, I didn't have that image with me, of course, but in my head, I kind of imagined it. So then when I took my photographs, I was altering the angle, shooting different angles, and sure enough, one of them matched up really well, as you can see here. Now, this probably sounded like a pretty basic tip because, frankly, it is, but it's surprising how many times people forget and they just grab a photo and then later on go, gosh, it doesn't quite match up with what I want. So just take some different angles. You have a much better chance of matching things up. Now, I'm going to show you some backgrounds that I've created that actually have a reference person in them, and that makes it even easier to shoot and match them up in the real photograph. So we'll take a look at that right now. The idea behind these backgrounds is that in each case you get two versions, one with a reference person standing in them, and yes, sometimes the reference person will be me as in these examples, but in each case you get the reference person standing there, the photos are taken on a tripod, so then the next photo doesn't have the person in it. So in each case you get two copies, one with the reference person, one without. Then in Photoshop, you load both of those images into Photoshop. So there's the two images, one without the reference person, one with. And then when you go to do your compositing, you have a reference to know this person should be this tall. Now I happen to know Claire is taller than me with those heels on, so that's why she's taller than me. You use the reference person there to help you, and then once you're happy, you hide the layer and you're well on your way to getting a great looking composite with the sizing done right. Now, not to make this into an advertisement, but you can check out these backgrounds coming soon to backgroundsforcompositing.com. So once again, if you can plan ahead, thinking of the kind of background you'll use, it'll make your life a whole lot simpler in Photoshop. Let's talk about green screen for a minute. Green screen was traditionally used in video work, both green screen and blue screen, as a simple way to extract someone, especially when there's movement involved. Now, there's something to be said for green screen for photography with a couple things in mind. The good part about green screen is if you use it, then you know this is the color you need to extract, and it can be a lot easier. The downside to green screen can be that depending on where you position the person, you can end up with fringes around them and more trouble than it's worth. Recently I worked on a project with Westcott and PhotoKey software that's used for green screen, and this is an excerpt that shows you some tips on both setting up your green screen and your lighting, and that can make a huge difference in success.
In this video, we'll be looking at the basics of setting up your green screen and your lights to have better success in the green screen software. So first, let's talk about the green screen itself. One of the first things you want to make sure you do is have it nice and smooth. So I have the green screen on a background stand, and I've also tied the end so I can stretch it out a little bit. Also got weights in the corners, again, all with the goal of having as few wrinkles as possible, because we want to get really nice, consistent, smooth green in the background. The other thing that's important, of course, is our lights. Now, today I'm using Westcott TD6 Spider lights, which are constant lights, which are great for green screen because you can see the results. I can stand here and look and see, is there any shadow being cast? And if there is, as long as it's way off to the side, that's okay. What I want to avoid is a shadow right behind. So you want to make sure your lights aren't too far in front, because that will cast a shadow directly behind you. Think about the way the green screen software works. It's looking for this one shade of green. So if you have a dark shadow, that's a very different shade of green and it won't pick it up as well. So we want to make sure that we're doing two things with our lighting. One is making sure the subject is properly lit, but also not casting the shadow. So as long as you keep those two things in mind, smooth green screen and proper lighting, you'll have great success.
So here's a quick summary. Make sure your green screen itself is very smooth, especially in the key areas around the person. The outside edges are not so important. Secondly, make sure your lights are pointing mostly at your subject, not casting a shadow on the background. That's the most important thing, is not getting a big shadow. Oh, and one other thing, make sure your subject is far away from the background. As far away as possible, actually, because then again, less chance of shadow and less chance of a bounce back, any kind of reflection off the background. Do those three things and you'll have a better chance of success. There is one advantage of green screen that's unique to using a green screen, and that's why I mention it for some people, and that is you can automate it in Photoshop, or at least it has the potential to get most of the work done for you, and that's only possible with green screen. So for example, if you were taking a whole series of portraits of a sports team and you wanted individual shots, you need to extract them all off that background, setting it up properly, and then using an action that I'll show you, you have the potential to do most of the work. So we'll see that in one of our lessons here on green screen. A while back I did a video for Westcott on how I used their lighting to set up for compositing. So rather than redo that whole thing, I'm just going to show you that video as part of our lesson on a way to set up your lighting to give you better results when you're shooting for compositing. Let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Dave Cross. I want to share with you a lighting setup that I like to use using my Westcott strobe lights. I like to call this lighting for Photoshop. And by that I mean I want to do two things. I'm going to use a lighting setup that's going to give me a really cool effect, but it's also going to make my life a whole lot easier because the whole purpose of this shoot is to extract someone off the background. Now, I'm a one-man show today, so I'm going to have to kind of wander around and show you some things. If you look behind me here, you can see I have my stand-in Emma. She's our full-time model here at Studio 3, and I got to tell you, people laugh about Emma and think she's a little creepy, but it's the best idea when you want to get your lighting set up before your subject actually arrives. She just stands there very quietly, get all my lighting set up, and it's good to go. Now, I've been very lucky in the last couple of months to have two very distinguished instructors here at my workshop center, Joel Grimes and Scott Kelby. And they both used a setup, a lighting setup, that I looked at and said, gee, that makes me feel pretty good because I was already kind of experimenting with a similar setup, and they just kind of helped me tweak the results. So this setup uses three lights. I'm using the strobe light kit, and all I've done is I've added two grids. I'm going to show you throughout the process what I mean by that. So for the rest of this, you'll just hear my voiceover as I describe what's going on. So let's take a look.
So here you can see the basic setup. I'm using the kit, the three-light kit, with two lights on stands, and the third light is on a boom stand. So that's really the only thing I've added to the kit is this boom stand. And you can see the stand there. And the two lights are pointing kind of diagonally at the model. Now the boom light has barn doors and a grid to really focus the lights. The other thing I'll be using throughout the shoot is the ON1 DSLR remote. This allows me to control my camera, check the quality, make sure everything looks good, and most importantly for me, when I'm a one-man show, change camera settings. You'll see me using that throughout the shoot to take test shots. Here's our model Darren, and I'm using the same setup I had for our test model Emma, taking a test shot. It looks like this. This is it right out of the camera. It looks pretty good, but I really want to test just the backlights. So a simple way to do that is to turn off the main light and then take another shot using just the backlights. So here I'm explaining to Darren and using the ON1 iPad app to take a shot. You can see here the results. Now it looks pretty good, but I want it to be even more focused, and this is the part that adds on. I'm adding a 60-degree grid that just snaps right in to the light, as you'll see here. Snap it right in, and this is going to really focus the light. So here we're taking another test shot, and you'll be able to see the difference of what a dramatic difference this makes. See how it gets just a beautiful light right around the outside. So now I know that those lights are set up the way I want. Go back and turn on the main light and start taking some shots. Notice how the background is gray because I don't have any lights on the background. Oh, and one of the things about being a one-man show, yes, you have to be the makeup artist as well to add more artificial sweat to your model. So here we're changing things up a bit. Just a different pose, holding the ball slightly differently. Same lighting though, so it's just a different look with the same lighting. I also want to try some more dramatic looks, and that's one of the beauty of this lighting setup, is you can try other things very easily. Here I'm just turning off the two backlights, so the only light I'm going to be having on here is the main light with the barn doors. Look at that kind of beautiful spotlight effect you get because of the grid. So with that experiment in mind, now we're just going to try changing up it only one light from the side. See, I'm just changing the position slightly and lowering it. I've never tried this particular setup before, but I just thought it might be interesting to try. And I had previously told Darren I'd like to pose with a ball a certain way that I thought might lend itself to this. Pretty interesting. So after we've done our lighting, here's what we end up with. We take a stock photo and add the person we've extracted pretty easily in Photoshop. Now just to show you it doesn't only work with sports, here's another shot of Darren and then put on a different background.
So as you can see, it's a pretty straightforward lighting setup that gives you a great way to separate the person from the background. Now to see the second part of how I extract Darren off the background and put him on new background, go to DaveCrossWorkshops.com to the blog and you'll see a tutorial on how to do just that. I'm Dave Cross. Thanks for watching.
Now in the video it mentions going to my blog to see the rest of the techniques. Well, you don't have to do that because that's in the rest of this course. Let's move on now to talk about backgrounds. As I mentioned, one of the main reasons for considering doing green screen photography for compositing is when you have to take a lot of people off the background quickly, and that suggests maybe we could automate it. So I'm going to show you first of all how to do it on a single image and then how we could also make this an action. So the concept is fairly straightforward. It just takes a couple of tries, or like I said, if you record this as an action then you don't have to worry about it. So the first thing we do is change the mode of our image to LAB color. When you do that, one of the things that changes is the way the channels look. In a normal photograph, a normal RGB file, we see a red, green, and blue channel. Here, if we click on the A channel, you can see there's already some pretty good separation between the person and the background, but it still needs a bit of help. So here's how we do it. First of all, very important, we duplicate the A channels. I did that by dragging it down on top of the new layer icon, and now at this point we can change the mode back to RGB color because we're going to have this channel here, and this is the one we're going to work on. Is called A copy. So we're going to use a couple of keyboard shortcuts here. Shift Delete or Shift Backspace is the shortcut for fill. We're going to make a couple of changes. First of all, we're going to tell it to use white, and then we're going to change the blend mode to overlay. Now what that's going to do is white is only going to lighten the areas in the middle, but you can see there's still just a hint of that gray. Then we go back and do fill again, but this time we're going to do black overlay. And all of a sudden you see that's getting a little darker, so we do black again. Each time I'm just pressing the keyboard shortcut, Shift Delete or Shift Backspace, and then I can do it one more time, but this time go back to white to get rid of that little bit of gray in the middle. Now, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty darn good channel considering I didn't do anything. I didn't have to paint anything. I didn't have to do anything at all myself. Now, ultimately, I would still want to get rid of these other areas here. But the last part of the step would then be to hold down Command or Control and click on this to load it as a selection. Then click back on the RGB and look at what we've got here. So now we're back to our Layers panel. I would suggest going now to the Refine Edge command, and we'll talk in more detail later on about how to really take advantage of this. But at this point, then we could turn this into a layer mask. Now again, we'll talk about these settings a little bit later on in other lessons. But for now, let's take a closer look and see it's not bad. There's a bit of that little green fringing. But considering the fact that we didn't have to do any manual work in terms of painting, it's still a really good start. So let's take a step back here. I'm going to delete that. I'm also going to go here and delete this extra channel. And now let's see how we could do this as an action. Now, if you're not familiar with actions, you go to the Actions panel. And the first time you want to create some kind of folder, they call them sets in Photoshop, to contain your actions. So I'm going to just use this one. Actually, let's just do a new one just to save confusion. Alright, so inside here I'm going to make a new action. Now it's very important, this is really important, that open one of your green screen photographs first before recording this action. If you try to do this and record opening the file, well, every time it'll open the same file. So make sure you start with one open, and we'll just call this something. I could give it a keyboard shortcut if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. At this point I click record. Now whatever I do next will be recorded. So these are the steps. Once again, I go to the mode and change it to LAB color. Then I click on the A channel and duplicate it by dragging it down to the little new icon there. And now once again I can change the mode back to RGB color. Now let's pause for a second, and you can see over in the Actions panel it's actually saying that. Convert mode, select A channel. That's not a channel, that's select A channel. Duplicate, convert mode back. Alright, so now we go Fill. And initially we're going to go white overlay, click OK. Fill again, this time black overlay. Generally we have to do that a couple of times. Now you could even try doing it one more and then finish off with white. In this case I'm going to do one more white just to be sure. Now when you're actually applying an action, you can choose to turn some of these on or off if you want to. But then the last part of the action would be Command or Control click to load it as a selection. Click on the RGB channel, and then make sure you have any selection tool chosen. And we're going to go Refine Edge. Now, for now, all I would do is this. I would click on Smart Radius and move this up a little bit. I would do Shift Edge a little bit, and then end up with a layer mask, click OK. And then stop recording. So now let's do this. Let's revert this image. Now I have this action and it's set to run completely automatically. So if I just click on the top of it here, you can see here's my action that's called green screen, and I hit the play button, it goes like this, and in a matter of no time at all, look at that, I've already got the extracted layer with the mask. Is the mask perfect? It's actually not bad, but if it's not, the other thing is you do have the ability to go to the Properties panel, and here's our mask, and we can go back to Mask Edge and do further work. And again, all of these things will be talked about in more detail later on in some of the other lessons. Now the other option we could do, let's just do one more thing. Let's revert this one more time. Is once you've finished recording the action, you can decide after the fact, okay, I want to change things up, I want to have more control. So you see right here where it says Refine Edge, and there's a little empty box beside it. If I turn that on, here's what will happen this time when I run the action. We'll still do everything else, but when it gets to that step, it'll give me the option of saying, how would you like to refine the edge? So that means you could both move sliders and also paint in here, as we'll be talking about. So all of those things will be options. Then when you click OK, it will create the layer mask. The real reason for doing this is not when you have one photograph like this, but if you had, as I mentioned, a whole bunch. Maybe there's like a sports team and you've got 80 kids you want to take photographs of for this Little League Baseball League or whatever it might be. What's going to happen is you can run this as a batch action, which means it'll do it to a whole bunch of photographs, and most importantly, you'll end up with this, a Photoshop document with a layer mask, so then you can continue to tweak the results. And don't forget, in some of the other lessons, we'll talk in much more detail about refine edge and mask edge and so on, but this just shows you why you'd want to consider using green screen and how you can potentially automate your work thanks to an action. One of the most powerful tools that can help us in our compositing is Camera Raw, and it doesn't matter whether you have a Nikon file or a Canon file or a JPEG or a TIFF. All of these can be opened in Camera Raw. And one of the things we can do to make our life even simpler is create a nice two-way street between Camera Raw and Photoshop, which doesn't happen by default. So let's take this one just as an example. When I double click on it, because it's in Canon RAW format, it opens up in Camera Raw. And here's the way it was shot. It's a little bright. I could certainly do things like crop it to get out the extra information I don't need, because all I really need is this area here. But here's what happens by default. If let's just open that, it'll take it into Photoshop and it'll open it. Problem is, that's kind of like it. That's the end of our journey, because at this point this is now in Photoshop and there's no relationship whatsoever back to Camera Raw. So if I decided actually I need to change the exposure, really at this point my only option would be to close it and start over again. So one of the things that we can do in Camera Raw, and it's a very important setting, and personally I keep this on all the time, is right down here at the bottom where it has what looks just like information. This is where we can choose things like how big a file do we want and all that kind of stuff. But a very important checkbox right here, open in Photoshop as smart objects. Now, the reason it's worded that way is it means it's almost like it's saying from now on, open every Camera Raw file into Photoshop as this thing called a smart object. Now let's see what that really means. For now, I'm going to deliberately make a bad choice and overexpose something to the point where it's just not looking very good at all. Now you notice the button says Open Object. So as before, it still comes into Photoshop, but with one very important difference, and that is it's a subtle one at first, but this symbol right here simply means that this is now this thing called a Camera Raw Smart Object. And that means if I double click on it, it goes right back to Camera Raw, and now I can adjust it however I want. So one of the ways that we can use this as an example in our world of compositing is to deliberately change the exposure. Like here, I don't really want her to be that dark, but it's making a better separation between her and the white background. So with that in mind, I'm going to click OK. So what I'm really doing is temporarily adjusting to make it easier to see what I'm doing. So for example, I'll just do a real quick one here, not worry too much about accuracy, but if I take the quick selection tool, you can see it's having no problem distinguishing the edge. I won't worry about selecting the rest for now, because the point is, once you've got a selection, now if I double click and go back and say, all right, let's put it back to the default settings and maybe just a little darker and a little more contrast. When I click OK, it updates in Photoshop but preserves the selection I've already made. So you see how it gave the quick selection tool a better chance of making a selection. The process is exactly the same no matter what you're doing. Here's a Nikon RAW file. I can double click on that and do the same thing. So, all right, I want to adjust the exposure to make it easier to distinguish between her shoulder and the background, her hair in the background. Hit Open Object, and as before, do the same thing, make my selection. And we'll talk more about this in full detail, but this is really the point, is from now on, every time you do this, you have the ability to go, all right, well, now that I've got my selection, let's play around with the exposure. I want this to be a darker kind of look. Click OK, and it will update while preserving my selection. Same rule applies with a JPEG or a TIFF, with only one difference, and that is if I double click on this file, it'll just open in Photoshop, period, as a JPEG. what I need to do is either press Command or Control R, that's the keyboard shortcut for open in RAW, and when I do that, now the same rule applies. When I hit Open Object, it will open in Photoshop. Technically, it still started out life as a JPEG, but now it has that same built-in ability to go back and forth into Camera Raw and make some changes. So just remember, you have to do this once. Personally, I leave it on all the time. All I ever do is sometimes maybe change the size or something, but I leave this checkbox on all the time. As long as that checkbox is on, and like I said, I leave it on, it's going to say Open Object on this button all the time. If for some reason you wanted to override that, holding down the Shift key changes it to Open Image, which means there's no longer a connection between Camera Raw and Photoshop. To me, I usually leave it on Open Object just because it gives me that ongoing background. The one thing that you will find, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about things like painting and so on, is when you have a smart object like this and you attempt to do anything like painting or cloning, you get this symbol, which I like to call the "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that" symbol, which just means you can't work directly on a smart object. So you'd have to do things on a separate layer, which frankly I would do anyway. It's completely up to you, of course, but I really suggest exploring this Camera Raw Smart Object capability because it really has a nice back and forth ability for you to over-adjust, under-adjust, make your selection, and then put it back the way you want. What if you're using a JPEG or a TIFF file and you don't want to use Camera Raw? Is there some way to do the same kind of thing in Photoshop? Well, there is. I'm going to actually use this one even though it is a RAW file. I'm just going to Shift double click to force it just to open as if it's a JPEG without any Camera Raw. Now let me pause and say I really think even if you're not up until now haven't been a fan of Camera Raw, you want to explore it because frankly it's just easier and you'll get better results, I think. But just so you can see, here's how it is at least theoretically possible to do the same kind of thing in Photoshop. So I'm going to use one of my adjustment layers. I could use levels or curves, but the important point is I'm doing it as an adjustment layer, not by going to image adjustments. The reason I'm doing that is because now I can over adjust my image and say I really want to see the distinction between her dress and the white background, and if I have to really push sliders in some crazy way to do that, then I will. I mean, here I've pushed this really far, but now my selection tool should do a pretty good job because there's such a contrast between the subject matter and the background. So the theory is kind of the same, it's just not quite as easy to work with because you have to push things really far and sometimes you lose, like in this case, a bit of detail. But if you want to do it with adjustment layers, here's how you do it. Add an adjustment layer, move things really far, make your selection, and then once you're happy with it, throw away the adjustment layer. So really the adjustment layer has only been there long enough to make the job of the selection tool a little easier. Given the choice, I would highly recommend this method of making sure you're opening in Photoshop as a smart object going back and forth to Camera Raw. However, it is nice to know that if you need to, for some reason where you're not able to or you don't wish to do smart objects through Camera Raw, you can still use the same concept using adjustment layers. In our first lesson on selections and how to make effective selections, we're going to talk about the quick selection tool and some of its pros and cons, and most of them frankly are pros, and I would almost always start with the quick selection tool. So let's start off. I'm going to press Command Control R on this JPEG file to open it in Camera Raw, and I want to just increase the contrast and exposure a little bit because I'm really looking at the edges here to see her versus the background. So then we'll open that into Photoshop. The quick selection tool shares the same spot as the magic wand, and some people like to use the magic wand. I would suggest for the most part, I just wouldn't recommend using it because sometimes it can be misleading. In other words, there'll be times where you'll click with the magic wand, it'll look like it's done a great job, but then when you move to the next step, you'll find that it really didn't do such a good job after all. So the quick selection tool works really nicely. It's really an edge detection tool. So anytime you look at an image and go, well, there's a pretty good definition between her shoulder and the background, then the quick selection tool should find it pretty well. The only real option we have in the options bar is auto enhance. I would generally keep that on unless you run into a problem where it's slowing things down considerably, where every time you use the tool you're seeing a progress bar going still working on it kind of thing. Other than that, it's just the size of the brush itself. So right bracket will make the brush bigger. I would want to get a decent sized shape for my brush, and then when you start to click and drag, you'll see it's finding whatever edge it can. And it's important to note, I'm not doing anything. I'm not holding down any keys or anything like that to try and make it better. I'm just continually dragging, and each time I do, it's looking to try and find whatever edges it can. And you'll notice that on something with very defined edge like shoulders and everything else, it's going to do a really good job. Where it gets to her hair, then it doesn't quite know what to do. And here, you'll notice what happened is when I start to drag on her hair, it went into the background as well. So this is where we need to be able to fine-tune our selection by adjusting it. So here what's happened is it's selected too much. So I hold down the Option or Alt key, and then I can go back over this area and say, I don't really want you to select this color. And now as I do that, you'll see it's got a better job. It's still missing some pieces, but what you have to go into thinking about is ending up with a really good selection. So at this point, it's not a good selection yet. We're going to have to refine it and make it a little better. But let's look at another example. We'll open this one in RAW, and again, I would just adjust the exposure a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. Zoom in a little bit, and here, same kind of idea. I'm barely moving my mouse, and what's happening is it's finding the definite edges. So things like her jacket and her pants and her shoes, and even her hair, it'll do an okay job. Now I wouldn't make kind of final judgments on this without looking at it a whole lot closer, so I could zoom in a little closer and see, okay, it got a little too much there. So once again, Option or Alt. Here I want to get a little closer, and it's missed a few hairs here and there, but overall I'm quite happy with that. And that's really what I think you want to consider doing with the quick selection tool, is kind of like the name suggests, do it quickly and get pretty accurate. And then in the next step, we'll be able to go in and refine that edge. Now, it is also possible, let's just deselect that, in some situations, you might find it easier to use the quick selection tool kind of the other way around and say, let's try and select the background first. Now, in this case, it's got a little too much of her. It's not stopping at her shoulder. So once again, I hold down Option or Alt to kind of take away from that. And then once you feel like you're getting pretty close, then you can just choose to select the inverse, which has the keyboard shortcut Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I. Now we're back to having just her selected, and once again I can continue to fine-tune that. So the approach you take doesn't really matter as long as you're ending up with a really good selection. I'm going to keep saying that because that's, to me, is really the key. You want to end up with a really good selection. Clearly, in our case here, we're not finished yet, but before we go on to refine edge, I want to throw out another idea to you in the next lesson, which is very, very important. If you could only walk away with one thing out of this course, this would be it, because frankly, this has saved me so much time since I started doing this, I can't even begin to describe to you how much time this has saved. Here's what I used to do. I would open the subject and start using the methods I'll be talking about, the quick selection tool and refine edge, and I would start to obsess over every little hair. So I'd be looking at her hair and trying to see all those little hairs and make sure they were all selected, and I'd take way too long, I'd zoom in way too far, and then one day something suddenly occurred to me, and that was I had done all that work, I had obsessed over every little single hair, and when I dragged her into the new background, I couldn't even see the hair. And I realized, why was I spending all that time worrying about details that wouldn't even show up in the context of the new background? And that's when I realized step one should always be drag the photograph of the person into the new background first before you do anything else. So right now I have my background open over here. I'm going to take my move tool. Now I have tab documents set up in Photoshop. You can also do this in other ways, but this is one of the simplest ways. Just drag, wait till it switches images, and then let go. Now clearly she's too big, so I'll do free transform, Command or Control T. I cannot see the handles for free transform, so now I'll press Command or Control 0 for fit on window, and that will let me see my handles. We'll scale her down to the approximate size we want. Somewhere around there, looks good. Now, one of the cool things that's happened here is even though I'd opened this file separately, I opened this file as one of those Camera Raw smart objects we talked about earlier, and even though I now dragged her into this new background, she's still a Camera Raw smart object. Well, she isn't, but the layer is. You know what I mean. So if I double click, that means I could use that same method talked about before. I was, okay, let's adjust the contrast and everything so we can do a better job of making a selection with our quick selection tool. I'll just get started on this because I'm just trying to show you the basic idea here. But really what I'm going to do is, now when I move on to the next step that I want to talk about, we will be talking about in a moment or two, which is this thing called Refine Edge, here's the difference. In fact, let me show it to you this way. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop in mid-sentence there, but just so you can see the difference. Let's go back to this one. This is just her independent without anyone there. If I choose Refine Edge, this dialog box comes up, but all I'm looking at it is in the context of this checkerboard transparency. So as I get closer and start looking at the detail, I'm like, oh, I don't see all those hairs there, and I start worrying about it. Compare that with this. This time I'll do Refine Edge, but I have it set here to something called On Layers. And what that means is right away I'm seeing her in the context of the new background. So clearly there's still work to be done, but the important point is I'm not worrying so much about every little single detail because I'm seeing her in the context of the new file. The other thing I would recommend is it's too easy to zoom in really close like this and try and get all these details. Don't go too far in, and make sure you periodically scale right back and kind of see it in the context of the overall photograph. So just to reiterate, do this first. Drag the person onto the new background first before you do any kind of selecting, and I think you'll find that in almost every case you'll be saving yourself time because you're not worrying about all those fine little details. You're just seeing it in the context. You can see, well, here I still need to fix up that, not seeing the real pavement there and so on, but it's just so much easier to do this first. So in every project we're going to undertake from now on, that's going to be step one. Once we do that, then the step of refining edge, working with our layer mask and so on, will just be that much easier. In the last session we saw one way to move a subject into a new background. That was by dragging between two different documents, and the only potential downside to that method is if your files aren't the same size. As we saw in that last example, our subject came in way too big and I had to transform her down to fit. So I just want to show you three other possible choices you could use. The first one, which frankly I don't use all that often, but you could, is under File, we choose Place. Then you go and find the file that you want to place, which is this one here. It's still a Camera Raw file, so when I choose Place, it's still going to open first in Camera Raw. I can still do the same kind of trick we mentioned before about playing with exposure and contrast. Click OK. But the advantage of doing this way is you can see it automatically scales her to fit. I can still make her a little smaller, which I think I want to do in this case, but at least it doesn't end up being this giant file that's too big. So that's the first method, and that's pretty good, although the only downside is you have to look at the file you want to place by file name. So option 2 is in Bridge. I can click once on the file to select it, and then I just go File, Place in Photoshop. So it sounds like the same thing, but the difference is I'm choosing it visually here, and I just have to make sure that in Photoshop the document I want is the active one. So I choose Place in Photoshop. Once again, it does a quick stop in Camera Raw. I click OK. Same thing, places it in. I can scale it down. Now, in each of these cases, or in all the cases I'm going to show you, it's still going to create a Camera Raw Smart object. And the last one, which is kind of nice, is in Mini Bridge. Mini Bridge is a panel you can have showing that is just, as the name suggests, a miniature version of Bridge, which means whatever I'm seeing in Bridge I can see in here, and I can then just drag and drop. So it's probably the most visual way. It still stops at Camera Raw, click OK, and it still scales her down to fit, and then I can scale down accordingly. Now, the one reason why I use Mini Bridge more than others is if there's ever an occasion where you want to drag more than one file in at the same time, this is the only place where you can do it. This is more than one. So in Mini Bridge, I can select 2 files. I just hold down Command or Control to select them, and when I drag them in, it's indicating to me I'm dragging more than one. So it's going to show, here's the first one. Click OK from Camera Raw, and then I can scale her down to fit and put her over here. As soon as I hit Enter, it's going to go, well, here's the second file, and then I can adjust the exposure and the contrast and all those things like we've said before, and scale her down and put her over here, whatever I want. Pretty much the same end result. And again, the nice thing is in each case, the end result is a Camera Raw Smart Object to give you that back and forth editing capability. So it really doesn't matter ultimately which method you use to combine images. Just remember, it should always be your step one. Now let's look at how we can fine-tune our selection, make it even more accurate in a couple of ways. First of all, making sure our base selection is as accurate as we can, and then using a wonderful command called Refine Edge. Now, one of the things that you'll find with the quick selection tools we talked about earlier is that you can always be adding and subtracting. The adding happens automatically. You don't have to hold down any keys. To remove from a selection, you hold down Option or Alt, and you see you get a little minus sign. Now, don't be surprised if there are times where you have to kind of go back and forth a little bit to add and take away, and it kind of almost learns along the way. Now, one thing you do have to keep in mind is sometimes there's not enough of an edge, no matter what you do, for the quick selection to find it. So one of the ways we can fine-tune a selection is also to do this, and that is switch tools. I'm just going to go to my lasso tool, and now I'll hold down the Shift key to add to the selection and just tell Photoshop I want to add this piece right here. And you'll see it just adds it in. Now if I had a little bit too much, I could hold down the Option or Alt key and remove this part to circle it around. So one of our recurring themes here is, remember, we want to end up with a really good selection. So don't worry about trying to get it in one shot. I might start with a quick selection tool and then switch to a different selection tool. Doesn't really matter. Just remember, other than the quick selection tool, every other tool you have to hold down a key, the Shift key to add to the selection, Option or Alt to remove from the selection. So at this point, I've got what looks like a pretty good selection, although I know I'm missing a bit of hair, but I'm not worried about that at this point. My base selection, as I would call it, is to get me started. Then I click on Refine Edge. Now mine is already doing this, but just so you know, these are the different options you can look at. The one that I find the most useful is on layers, and that's because, remember, we've already dragged her onto her new background. And the reason I do that is because, as I've said a number of times, and I'm going to keep saying it, it's so much easier to make decisions based on the context that you're in. In other words, I'm seeing her on the background. I used to do things like look at it on a white background, but then I'd start to go, oh, this doesn't look good, that doesn't look good. And it might not look good on a white background, but unless your intention is to keep her on a white background, why not look at it in context? Now, there's nothing wrong with occasionally going to black and white view to take a look at what the mask you're going to get. I would do that too, but I'm going to spend most of my time with this on layers. Now we need to talk about how we adjust the edge. Remember, the quick selection tool found the edge, now we're trying to refine it. So here's the first thing I would say is, if you look at your image and suddenly realize, oops, I missed a whole part of her elbow, this is not the place to fix it. In a case like that, you'd want to cancel, go back and redo your selection, and then come back to Refine Edge. This is really for, I already have a really good start on my selection, I'm just trying to make the edge a little better. There is a function called Smart Radius here, which means it will attempt to distinguish between things that should have hard edges, like her arms and legs and so on, and things that have softer edges, like her hair. The challenge is, where do you put this? If I move this slider up really high, while it's starting to get more hair, it's actually not doing very good things to her arms. In fact, let's show you the mask. You can see that's just not good at all. So I don't want to go that far. In fact, I would normally do this just a little bit, and what I really use is this tool. It's called the Refine Radius tool. It's actually already chosen by default. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit closer here. And all I'm going to do, I have a really small brush size, and I'm just kind of brushing over where I think there might be a few more hairs in here that I want to get. And you'll see it basically finds them. if you kind of go halfway on her existing hair or the parts you want to get, you can do the same thing here. See, I think there's a few more hairs sticking out here. Now sometimes what will happen is you'll do that and you still won't see anything. However, if you go to this black and white view, often you'll see, well, I actually did find some little hairs. Look at that. We go up a little bit. You see this? It's found some of those fine little hairs that were there. And remember, we're looking at this with the background in mind. That actually looks pretty good to me, although I can see there's just a tiny little bit around her legs here. I still have to fix this part. We'll fix that later on. So I could try painting around, but that would be kind of laborious to do that. So what I usually do is just shift the edge a little bit, just kind of a negative amount. Now keep in mind this also, I'm zoomed in greater than 100%. So some of the decisions I'm making may not be the best. The other thing is, this is not my final adjustment in terms of contrast and brightness and things like that and exposure, because I'm going to go back to Camera Raw. This was just to get a good selection. So I would normally attack it this way and go, well, that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to output this to a layer mask, which means preserve the Camera Raw Smart Object, but output the end result to a layer mask. So when I click OK, now I have my so-called finished product, but it's not really finished yet because a couple things. First of all, this is Camera Raw. I want to double click on that Camera Raw Smart Object to say I really increase the exposure, but when I photographed this, I deliberately was trying to make it have a little darker feel to it. I might lighten up the blacks just a little bit, but that's kind of the look I was going for, as a more dramatic kind of a look. So I click OK. That'll go back to Photoshop and update. Now because this has created a mask, it also means that I can continue to work on it. For example, down here in my original selection, I realize I missed a little bit, so I would just take my lasso tool and just do a little selection in here, and then on the mask fill that with black. Now black is my background color, so I press Command Delete or Control Backspace as a quick way to fill with black. Now in this case I wouldn't actually remove the shadow because I kind of want that there, and as we'll see later on, we're going to build on this to add more of a shadow to try and make it look more realistic. But overall, that's the approach I would take. So Refine Edge is going to be a really useful tool for you, but it starts with having a good selection to begin with. I'm going to save this so we can come back to it later. Just save it as a copy. I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document so that it'll be just like this when I come back to it later on. Now just to go back a second, I'm going to load this as selection and then delete the layer mask so we can talk about Refine Edge for one more second. One of the challenges that we face here is that there is no magic number, and I just want to stress that because I've talked to a lot of people say, I can't get this to work. I try at a low number, a high number. Technically there are probably some range of numbers that work better than others, but I found it really varies so much with the image. And the approach that I often take is I'm quite happy with the result I got here doing it in one shot. But if you have challenging hair, and that's the biggest challenge, of course, with making a selection of things like fur and hair and things like that. If you have something with what I would call very challenging hair, then what you want to do is approach it in pieces instead of trying to do it all at once. And we'll look at that next. Here's an approach I would take when I'm faced with a challenge, when I'm worried that someone has, for example, really lots of hair blowing in the wind or something, and I want to make sure I'm getting both a nice hard edge on the edges of her arms and body and legs and so on, but a nice soft edge on her hair. So let's go get a file. I've got this background, and as we well know by now, I'm going to bring the person onto the background first. It is a Camera Raw file, so I think I'm going to play around with some settings in here. I want to give my tools the best opportunity to select all of her hair, so I think I'm going to push the contrast and even the clarity a little bit. Click OK, and then we can collapse Mini Bridge. Let's see what we've got here. I think she needs to be just a little bit smaller, like she's in the foreground posing for us here. So once again, this is a Camera Raw Smart Object. Now the first thing I do is duplicate the Camera Raw Smart Object. Command or Control J. You can also do it through other means, but that's the keyboard shortcut for duplicate layer. And by doing that, now I have two copies of the same smart object. And what that means is if I update one, they'll both update. And that's going to be very important for us. So let's start off on this top one. I'm going to hide the other one. And I'm doing that so that when I start using Refine Edge, I can see through to the background. Now I'm going to use my quick selection tool, and all I'm really focusing my attention on here is her hair. Now, another little tip for working with hair is don't worry about trying to get every little bit. The little pieces are ones we can get by using Refine Edge. So all I'm really doing is kind of going head and shoulders a little bit. I want to remove this part right here. That looks pretty good. Then I go to Refine Edge. So don't be surprised if it looks like a floating head out in space because, well, it kind of is for now. That's because we have another copy of this layer we're going to use for the rest of her. But the advantage in doing it this way is, remember, I still have it set on Layers View. Let's click on Smart Radius and push it up really high and see what happens. And you can see it's picked up, look at that, it grabbed every little hair. Now it's doing some weird things to her arms, but that's okay because those are the areas that we're going to add on here. So let's get just a little bit closer. I've got a really tiny brush in here, but look at that. You see it's even picking up the little small hairs that we couldn't even see before. So I just do a little bit like that. Let's switch our view to black and white for a second to look at the mask. Even though I see bits of gray here and there, that's okay. I can deal with that. What I'm really looking at is her hair and the detail it's getting. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to click Make a Layer Mask and click OK. Now let's leave that for a second and go to this one. Click on it and then show it. And now we're kind of doing the opposite. All I'm really worried about is her body and her arms because we already have her hair. Still don't want this part in the middle though. And just to be sure, I'm going to make sure we have right up to kind of her neck there. Don't want this part, but I do want this part of her body. One little quick tip, by the way, is when you're making a selection before you go into Refine Edge, just press Q for Quick Mask, and that'll give you this kind of colored overlay, and you can see if you're missing anything really obvious. I do want to scroll down and make sure I'm not missing any part of her. That looks pretty good. All right, Refine Edge. We're still set on black. Let's go to On Layers. And again, it looks a little weird because we don't see her head, but that's okay. I already have that. I'm just looking here at her arms. That all looks really nice to me. So we choose Layer Mask and click OK. So now we have one layer with the layer mask for her body. When I show this one, oh, there's the rest of her. And I've got a really nice selection. However, the coloring and the contrast is a little bit off because remember we pushed those further so I could see what I was doing. So because this is two copies of the same smart object, I double click on either one of them, or either one if you prefer, and let's put this back the way it was. I think I still want a little more contrast than that. And exposure down just a bit maybe. Something like that, perhaps. Maybe just put this clarity just a little bit to get some mid-tone detail a little bit. Click OK. It updates both of them, and we have our little finished product. Now don't be surprised if sometimes this happens. You see that there's really no line around the outside in this view, but when I go to a scale down view, I can see it. If you're concerned about that, and usually it's not a problem, but just in case, click on the layer mask and just add to it. Just make a marquee selection, fill with black, click on the other one, fill with black, and then just do that on each of them just to make sure we're not in fact seeing any, that those lines really won't be visible. So I just, on each case, fill with black. So overall that looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with that. I would look a little more closely, for example, in here. I really don't want gray in between her arm. In the next lesson we'll see how to deal with that. So I'm going to save this as a PSD so I can talk about it in the next session on fine-tuning a layer mask. When we last saw Selena, she was in Italy looking pretty good, but we still had to do a couple little things to her. And this topic is, when you've got this far, you've got either one layer with a mask, or in our case, the two pieces that we did before, and we've got a mask, and we want to fine-tune that mask. So there's a couple of aspects to this. Now in this case, we have two layer masks, well, two layers, each of which has its own layer mask. So that adds a little bit of complexity, but I prefer to keep them separate like this just in case I need to do further tweaking. I don't want to really combine them yet until I know that they look the way that I want. So the one that's going to cause us the most challenge is the layer mask for her hair. So in order to view the layer mask, hold down Option or Alt and click once on the mask. Then we'll go a little bit closer and we can see what we've got. The cool part is it's got all these little hairs which look really good. Anywhere where you see gray that should be black. In other words, this black area means it's completely masked, so we'll see through the background. So realistically, this area here should also be black. I don't really want there to be shades of gray in here. Down here, I'm not so worried about it because I know I have a separate layer that has the rest of her arm, but this gray around her hair I don't really want. I mean, if it's a very, very light gray, like maybe over here, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But here's one of the best things ever invented. There are some areas, for example, in here where I'm seeing gray and I don't want gray there. I want to make sure it's white. So here's the greatest trick ever invented, and that is normally a paintbrush looks like this, right? It's in normal mode, 100% opacity, and you choose a nice soft edge brush around that big. And the problem is, if I start painting with white, I'm going to press X to get white as my foreground color. It's great when I'm working inside somewhere, but if I slip, I suddenly gone too far and ruined everything. Same thing applies to black. If I'm painting with black, I don't want to have to be so careful about staying within the lines. So here's a great trick. If you change the blend mode of the paintbrush to overlay, and I usually lower the opacity just at least a little bit, what this means is now when I'm painting with white, watch over here, it's going to only paint over the parts that are white and not touch the black parts. So that way I don't have to worry about kind of going outside the lines. It'll probably be easier to see here if I press the letter X to swap to black. Look at that. I was able to paint right inside there, and it looks like my paintbrush is going into the white, but it doesn't matter because I've got this overlay mode turned on. So I could say, I think maybe I do want a little more see-through. Let's lower the opacity just a little bit more. And around this hair here, I still want to get those fine little hairs, so I'm just kind of clicking a little bit to try and get rid of just a little bit of that gray. One of the things we've talked before about obsessing over things, I used to spend too much time in this layer mask view and then realize once again I wasn't seeing it in the context of my background. Are you tired of hearing me say that yet? But that's really the reality. So I want to show you what overlay mode does, but here's how I'd actually use it. Make sure you're viewing the layer and then click on the mask. Now I can still paint in that mode, but for example here, remember I was starting to worry about is there too much gray there, but frankly it looks pretty good to me. And the same with her hair here, it looks fine. I don't think I have to worry about that. Her arm edge looks good. So I would just do a quick check, Option Alt click on the layer mask just to make sure you didn't cut anything off completely, and don't again worry about this one because remember we have this other one that we can look at. I would probably come in here, press X to get white, and just make sure I didn't miss any part of her arm there. And down here just a bit, just to make sure I don't think I cut anything off there, like that. Now, if you're a keyboard shortcut kind of person, I know I am because I like to work as quickly as possible. Here's a couple of shortcuts that you can use on the fly that are really useful when you're fine-tuning the mask by painting like this. So the first one I've already mentioned a couple times, letter X switches back and forth between black and white, which is very important because we want to be able to do that, flip-flop, when we're painting on the mask between either white or black. So rather than moving our mouse and clicking on anything, that's just easier. If you really like keyboard shortcuts, here's a couple that are really nice. When you're using the paintbrush and you want to change the opacity, right now my opacity is 45. Let's say I was painting down here and I want to jump to 70%. All I have to do is press 7. And that changes the opacity of my paintbrush to 70%. So it's really just the first letter, 8 for 80, 4 for 40, 5 for 50, and so on. Because we might want to switch between overlay and normal a lot, this one is pushing keyboard shortcuts a little bit, but just so you know, Option or Alt and the Shift key, and then N is normal, O is overlay. So as I want to switch back and forth, I can really concentrate my attention on the painting on the mask part and not worry about going up and changing tool settings. So that's the first part I would consider. The other thing we can do, which is quite interesting, is go to, in CS6 it's the Properties panel. Before CS6 there was a panel called Masks. Now Masks is part of Properties. And if we come down here to where it says Mask Edge, this is almost, well, it really is giving you a second chance
at refine edge. So the way it works is when you have a selection, you use refine edge. When you have a mask, you can go to refine mask. So it's giving me one more chance to go, what if I just tweak this a little further and try a bit more or shift the edge a little bit? So if you notice something at this point, this is really nice because it's giving you one more shot to try and tweak the results a little bit. So I would start off by painting on the layer mask, taking full advantage of that overlay mode to kind of fine-tune a little bit, and then look at that mask edge if you need to do any overall results. Now some people may be looking at this and going, but you still have two separate layers. Yes, I do. And frankly, I'm okay with that because stop looking at the layers panel and look at the image. It looks fine. As long as I'm not seeing an obvious, oops, there's a cut between her head and her body, that looks fine to me. Ultimately, I'm going to save this as a PSD, which is my working layer document, and then I would save a copy in some merged, flattened version like JPEG or something else to give to someone, but at least this way I'm preserving both. And part of the reason is, again, remember, two copies of the same smart object. I double click on either one, say maybe I just need to change the color temperature a little bit so she matches in a little better. We click OK. It updates both of them while still preserving the layer mask. This is a very short little topic, but it's something that comes up just about every time that I talk to people about compositing, and that's, what about feathering? You didn't feather anything. Shouldn't you feather things? That used to be a very common technique, was you'd make a selection, add a little bit of feather, and the idea was that would make the edge blend better. Personally, I don't think that's the case. I think most of the time that's what throws people off and it looks unrealistic, is the fact that the edges are just a little too soft. What I would suggest is this. I'll just click on this background layer so I can show you something. When you have a selection, yes, there is a command under Modify called Feather. Here's the problem with this. It's a very permanent decision. Whatever number I put in here, if I say I just want to feather 1 and click OK, that's going to soften the edge very, very slightly, but it's going to stay that way from then on. So anything I do, I can't get it back. So if I go into Refine Edge and go, gosh, that edge looks a little bit too soft, there's no command in here that's going to fix it. So my suggestion would be this. If you feel, and you might, and I'm not saying don't ever use feather, but here's what I am saying. If you feel the need to feather something, don't add the feather while you're making a selection. Do it later on here in the Properties, or previous versions, Mask panel. So here's what it would look like. I would click on the layer mask that I want, go to Properties, and here's the feather command, but there's one very significant, important difference with this. Now, it's not going to look good in this case, I'm just telling you. When I put the feather up to a certain number, the big difference is there's no OK button. I never actually click OK to say feather this much. I just leave it that way, and then when I come back later, it's still set that way. So you never actually click OK and it's permanent. Let's say, for the sake of argument, I left it at a feather of 3.9, and then tomorrow I opened it and went, yikes, that looks really bad. I can put it back down or take it back to 0 completely. So if you decide that in the context of your background it would actually make sense for you to do a little bit of feathering, then I would highly recommend doing it through Properties, or in previous versions, Masks panel, because it's non-destructive feathering, and that's one of the only ways to do that. Otherwise, you're going to feather something and then, frankly, you might regret it later on.